It's Farrar's new transmission cooler. Yay! Um, what happened? His factory cooler went to leaking prolifically. Made an unbelievable mess all over the underside of the car, all over my driveway. In fact, the remnants of that puddle are still back there. When we get to back the car, I'll show it to you. A month later, after being rained on, after being degreased, I degreased the engine last night, you can still see where that puddle was. But anyway, I went to tighten down the takeoff line. It seemed to be where it was leaking from. And the instant I put my wrenches on the flare fitting, it just went snap clean in two. I don't know if it was cracked or what, but those flare fittings, they're made out of like the world's worst steel. It's like worse than hardware store steel. I mean, you'll round over a flare nut even with a 6-point wrench without even trying. I mean, if they made flare fittings out of grade 8 steel, we'd all have a good day. But they're made out of this god-awful steel. But anyway, moot point. I told Farrar, I said, look, I got to fix your cooler anyway. Why don't we use the opportunity to relocate the cooler to the front of the car? And there are a couple of advantages to put the cooler up front here. First and foremost, the factory cooler did not coexist well with Farrar's exhaust system. Both the design of the exhaust system and the size tubing that was being used, they were commingled pretty severely. I mean, I made it work, but it was far from optimal. Now, he's got basically the same amount of clearance on both sides of the transmission. I mean, he's just got oodles of space back there. Clearance is not an issue anymore. And then, of course, the other advantage to putting the cooler in the front of the car here is this is where the airflow is. I mean, there's a reason they put the radiator and the condenser in the front of the car. Of course, they didn't use air to cool the transmission fluid in the factory design. They used 200-degree radiator coolant. Don't know how effective that is. This thing here, when these radiator fans fire up, they just blast this cooler. I mean, it's like a hurricane. And then the design of the cooler, this is what's known as a parallel flow design. So it's got channels on either side and then multiple paths connecting the channels together. Just like a radiator. And in the bad old days, the transmission coolers were what called tube and fin. You had tubing that would loop back on itself, then you had fins that would join the tubing together. Well, parallel flow is like 25 to 33% more efficient than tube and fin. So this is a very efficient designed cooler. It's bathed in air. And then it's also connected to the back of the car by about 14 feet of metal tubing. This is the metal tubing that connects it to the back of the car, and that metal tubing will also radiate heat. The two sides of the frame are basically identical to each other now. The passenger side, you have the two heater core lines and then a piece of air conditioning hose, and then on the driver's side you have the two transmission cooler lines and a piece of air conditioning hose. But I don't know if you all can see, there's a bulge right here in the hose right next to the hose clamps. Those, by the way, are high pressure hose clamps. I don't have any way of making a bead in tubing, so what I did was I soldered. It's actually a modified fitting. You see it's about a 1/2 inch long. There's a big old fitting in here that acts as the bead, and that's what the hose clamp is butted up against. And so that's coming from the cooler. This is the hard lines that go towards the back of the car. Scooching under here. It's nice not having to use the creeper. When the puddle was under here, I had to use the creeper, and the casters on my creeper don't like to pivot around anymore, so I have to sling it around. But This is the tubing coming from the front of the car, and these are your hoses that then go over to the transmission itself. This is the line that takes off from the transmission going to the cooler. And then if you look, I don't know if y'all can see, but way up in there, there is a fitting. That's your return fitting. I promise you, it's up there. And then, like I told you, I mean, he's just got plenty of space now for his exhaust system. There's, nothing at all in the way. The way Farrar's exhaust system is designed, it takes off from the engine there. Then the tubing just loops around to the mufflers and goes out the back of the car. Same thing on this side. The tubing takes off from the engine, loops around, and then goes out the back of the car. And this is his engine, all nice and clean. I degreased everything last night. Oh, this is the puddle I was telling you about, the remnants of it. About a month later, you can still see where this thing was just hemorrhaging transmission fluid. Just made an ungodly mess all over my driveway. But Farrar's engine is nice and clean now. Blasted it with degreaser and with water last night. Just bathed the whole thing, top and bottom. Let me fire this thing up. Be kind of noisy under the car, so I probably won't be able to narrate, but I'll point the camera at the fittings so you'll be able to see that everything's nice and tight. Just a second. One thing. This inspection window on the underside of the transmission, if you look in this direction, you can't quite see to the rear main seal, but you can see to the plate that holds the rear main seal. So if your rear main seal is leaking, you should be able to look up through here and see oil. And then you can't see the torque converter, obviously, but you can reach up in here, and if your fingers come out dry, then your torque converter's not leaking. So that's kind of a handy inspection window to have. Believe it or not, his pan does not leak, even with that decrepit old gasket on it. I beefed the gasket up with some anaerobic sealant. And because the gasket's pitiful. I mean, in fact, here's a piece about to break off now. There you go. That's his gasket just coming apart at the seams. But as you can see, the pan is tight. It does not leak. So hopefully we are getting close to being finished with this project again. Where have you heard that before? Like I said, this transmission cooler leaking, that was not planned, but in the end it actually worked out for the best, because I like the cooler in the front a whole lot better. I've only got the car up in the air here. By the way, people say, ooh, you can't work on jack stands. What do I have that thing? About 2 feet in the air? I mean, I've gotten them higher than this. There's plenty of room to scooch around under here. But this is the passenger side of his engine. A 3.0, you cannot use a DeLorean oil filter. The thread is different. 3.0, it's a metric 20 by 1.5, and DeLorean, I believe, is 3/4 by 16. And so that's not a DeLorean oil filter, but it's shaped like a DeLorean oil filter because you got to have enough clearance for the oil pressure sending unit. So that's an STP filter. The label's up towards the top. That I found that basically shaped the same, but has the proper thread fitting. There's Farrar's starter motor. And then over here on this side, that's his alternator. In the stock 3.0 location, it's using a 3.0 mounting bracket. You get a lot more airflow, of course, down low here than you would with the alternator being up high next to the exhaust manifold. So that's, I mean, our poor alternators, they're fighting an uphill battle as it is because they're turned around backwards. And then you put them right up next to the exhaust manifold and you're just asking for trouble. But that's his alternator. I painted his engine cradle. Paint job got a little battle scarred underneath where I've been jacking it up. It wasn't hard enough for me to really be putting the floor jack on it. So I'll touch that up. But that's his engine cradle all painted. There's his mufflers. I tried to clean the lens on this little camera, and I used rubbing alcohol, and now it's all white and hazy. I can't tell what this thing is pointed at. I may be reaching the ends of the limits of this little camera. I made a video, of course, that describes what I did on his engine. I didn't mention in that video, this is his block ground right here. It's battery cable. Rather than using a that braided strap on the motor mount, that is battery cable that then goes over to a brass bolt kind of up underneath the coolant line there. And that's his engine, that's his transmission cooler. Who knows, maybe one of these days we'll be finished with the little car. We're working on it. I'll keep you updated.